Right. So let's talk about onboarding states for analytics stacks. So I saw the problem that we had right now as once we've initialized the stack or requested that we initialize the stack, there's no way of knowing what state that's in until it completes successfully. If it doesn't complete successfully or takes a while to complete successfully, we don't get any feedback about that. So
the only feedback we get is that the Jitsu keys in the database.
That it's complete.
Yeah. So we know that state that exists. The problem therein lies from a front end perspective. If we don't have the Jitsu key, but someone has started that process, we don't know that that's finished. So if they refresh or go somewhere else, or another user goes on and clicks, let's start the product analytics process, we don't know that started. So we won't show them the current where they are currently, in other words.
So my first thought was, okay, well, there's a plaster here we can stick on this at least temporarily, which is we can store in the session, or not in the session, in the persistent Redis state that project has had it initialized, and then we can delete that key from Redis once we've got either a positive or a negative response from that, at which point we'll know whether it's safe or not to show the user that initialization button again.
Question, actually, very quick one around Redis on our stack. Is our Redis instance synonymous across all instances of GitLab, or do we have multiple Redis instances?
It depends.
I mean, is it like a one-to-one key type situation? Is there any chance that someone will then visit a different GitLab endpoint instance and get a different result from Redis?
No. So .com runs multiple Redis instances, but the situation that you describe, as far as I'm aware, is not possible.
Okay.
And Geo as well, I think, run independent Redis instances for different locations. I'm not sure what they call them, zones. But again, not something we need to worry about for this. We're using the Redis shared state rather than the session, so it will persist for as long as we tell it to. So that's fine as far as I'm aware. And I know the folks in the compliance team have used it for a similar sort of workflow in the past as well, and it's worked quite well.
Yes, I'm trying to remember what it was for. I can't remember.
I can't either.
Yes, you are right.
Being slightly skeptical and then seeing it working and being like, "Oh, that's cool. That works well."
I was involved in it as well, but I can't remember.
Well, that's good. It hasn't bothered you, so it can't be too bad. So my thing is, right, we could put in this Redis key, add it before we enqueue the job, delete it once delete it once we've received a response. And I think from what you're saying, you're fine with that, but the thing that we don't have is any sort of connection to the front end. So there's a few different ways we can tackle this. Number one, we can actually, I say that like I've come up with some amazing ideas. So there needs to be a GraphQL way of finding out the state of the current stack, right?
And we don't currently, through any kind of API, share our Redis state either. That's made pretty clear in our documentation that we don't share that into what that state is, or workers for that matter.
What do you mean?
Go in the conversation that I had with Jiaan on the other issue, which I think is linked to further down. We found documentation that mentions about it. There you go. Halfway down my comment, there's a link to comment 116, blah, 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 blah. And then, and then docs, interaction with Sidekick, Redis, and APIs. There's a whole, we don't expose any of that, basically, is what I mean.
Interaction with Sidekick, Redis, and Sidekick APIs. That's okay. We don't want to use Sidekick.
But it's a worker.
We're not using Sidekick. I don't even know what Sidekick Redis is. Because no, this is saying that we shouldn't interact with Sidekick's low-level interaction with Redis rather than GitLab's Redis connection. So yeah, we shouldn't be interacting directly with Sidekick and how that deals with Redis. That's a different problem.
Oh, okay. Ignore me then.
Yeah, I see the mistake, but no, that's fine. So in which case we need to decide how we're going to expose this information to the API to front end. And the best way to do that, I guess from the front end, what do you want to see? Like, and can we make that happen?
I mean, the optimum solution is to have a single source of truth, because as noted in this table right now, we've got multiple different backend endpoints that need to be checked to validate where we are in terms of the stack in creation process, which is going to involve multiple API calls and be quite network intensive and could probably be optimized. So having that state machine, we don't need to store the state on the database level. We just want to have some kind of endpoint which tells us where we're at currently. So if we bring up that Redis thing, do we have application settings, which would actually be a HAML check anyway, so we can ignore that? Do we have we created the stack, or is the stack running, which would return whether we've got Redis or not? Where the same with the Jitsu key, and maybe return the Jitsu key, although we might need to add that to the product.
Yeah.
GraphQL endpoint anyway, so I'm not sure about the one. We then need to make a check to see if Cube has any data, not the data. We just need to know whether Cube has data, because then that tells us that we're going to get that the dashboards are going to work, if that makes sense. And then we've got the endpoint that you're building right now for the dashboard widgets, which needs to be its own thing anyway, because as soon as we know Cube has data, we then move on into the second phase. There's this whole separate application. There's two applications. There's the onboarding application, and then this separate, which is listing and viewing dashboards, so that we can probably ignore that point at that point. So I don't know, which is why I said the first instance, having that Redis with an API with an API endpoint is fine, but we could also make this so it is like a instant state checker state machine. I know it's not hard coded, but anyway, which just does the exact same thing but without being specific to Redis. That makes sense?
I think there's a specific. We could create a GraphQL type that's available from project, called product analytics stack status or something like that, which returns a list of booleans. Is it enabled? Is the stack working? Is the worker running? Does Cube contain data, etc., etc.? Whether or not we should include all of those keys in the first instance, I don't know.
Well, that's right. For now, we don't need to. Like, we can do the Cube, the front end can query Cube. Obviously, we don't. Obviously, we're skipping a middleman by having the backend do it for us. A round trip, but we can do that as the first instance to keep the iteration small. Just creating that Redis key and then adding it to the existing project endpoint, or creating a new endpoint just for analytics. Either way, I feel like that's.
Yeah, I agree. I think and that we can have a status object, which we can add to later, necessarily, if we want to, and that can be it can be a type. It doesn't have to be linked to any active record model. We might just create a Ruby class as well to handle the logic, figuring that stuff out. It's all in one place and easily testable.
Which and it should be is literally if statements, more or less.
Okay, so the implementation plan. So this still stands. We
still need that key, and that'd be first step anyway before we even start making use of it.
And then create a new GraphQL type, something along the lines of it'll be a projects which you could traverse to product analytics stack status, something maybe slightly more pithier named. Fields on that should be I guess stacks. It's not really the stack status, it's project analytics status. It's the status for all of it, because it's not just the stack necessarily.
It depends. I mean, if we want to make this as per, so there's a Jiaan made a list of different states that we
Yeah.
could have, which we don't necessarily need to cover every one of them. But I mean, you can start off with, do we have project settings? Is it project stack enabled? So that'd be one status. Then the next status is, do we have a stack at all? No. Do we have any? Do we have a Jitsi key? No. Do we have any data in Cube? No. Do we have any dashboards? But then again, that's where I draw the line, because that's where the listing comes in, and it's a separate thing entirely.
It's
because
more,
that's irrelevant of the stack. That's got nothing to do with product analytics.
We need right now. We need to know
Redis key and Jitsi. Those are the two things we need
so
to complete it
Jitsi
as it is immediately.
So we can add the Jitsi key to the project.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
fine. So because that's already there. Is the Jitsi key a private value though?
It's a project setting.
Yeah, it's a project setting, but I'm pretty sure it's encrypted.
Oh, you've encrypted the key.
Well, and the fact it's encrypted isn't necessarily a problem, but it's do we want to be then exposing it? I'm just
I don't know if it's encrypted. We do have to expose it though, because that's the key that's needed for JavaScript to connect.
It's not encrypted. Oh, I'm thinking of the
login
details. Login details. Yes, that's right. They're encrypted.
Yes, yeah, definitely. We ain't sharing those.
No, that's fine. Okay, so we're adding Jitsi key to project type.
Which we can always do as a separate issue if you want. I have a separate issue, so I can add that there, because this isn't necessarily.
Adding Jitsi key to project type will take about 30 seconds.
Okay.
So that's fine. So then the other one is project analytics status, and go I guess it's stack initializing. I don't really like having like a deduced Boolean as a GraphQL field.
Yeah. I guess what we want I guess we need to know. So enabled would be one, but you could have a stack created but then turn off the setting in admin, couldn't you?
Yeah, true. So no, but the thing you want to know is, has someone requested it, but it's not done yet?
Yes, I guess so. Are we saying that this isn't a state machine? This is just is the stack?
No, I don't think it can be a state machine, because they can be in multiple states at the same time.
So then we should probably call this problematics instance status or stack status or I don't know, rather than just because product analytics status infers a broader scope.
Yeah, that's true. Whereas it's almost meta status, or status meta.
Status meta. Yeah, so from that we need I
guess it's initializing then.
Yes, is initializing.
All right, I'm going to pause the washing machine.
And that's it.
Sorry, real life here.
That's fine. Is initializing that's all we need, because after that we should have the Jitsi key.
Yeah.
And that tells us that it's initialized. And before that, if is initializing is false, then it means you haven't started that process anyway.
Yeah, so that's all you
need. So that is all we need, is something along those lines. Ooh, Jiaan's here.
Hello, Jiaan. Just as we'd finished, Jiaan. Classic Jiaan.
Great, then you can just catch me up on the details.
That's all right, we recorded it. You can catch it up later.
Oh, awesome.
We just updated the implementation plan. We weren't miles off, I don't think, but we just needed to make sure how we were exposing that in the best possible way for you front-enders to implement it. So we're going to add a new GraphQL type, project analytics status meta, which for now will just hold the is initializing field, so you can tell whether or not we're waiting for a response from a scikit worker.
Why can't we include the rest of the states?
Such as
the ones listed in the proposal.
So for starters, whether we've got dashboards or not is a separate state entirely. That's got nothing to do with the stack. That's entirely to do with the project itself, if that makes sense. So I'd probably draw the line at that one, at whether we have dashboards or not, because that's an entirely different GraphQL endpoint anyway, isn't it? That we have to query. If that makes sense. We've got to query that to find, even if the backend did it, you still have to query that to find out if there are any and run the whole traversal stuff. If that makes sense. The no instance data, yes, we could add that in future and just cut out that round trip to say, do we have any data in Cube at all? That some backend can do. But for now, at least, we can run it on the front end, at least for the first iteration, can't we? And then improve upon that. By that, I mean first iteration of this implementation plan. Instance initializing we've already discussed. No project instance would just be that their status is initializing as false and there is no Jitsu key, which is going to be added to the project's GraphQL input anyway. And then post initializing, we just say, do we have a Jitsu key, don't we? So it doesn't matter about the rest.
But we're going to create this new type called analytics status meta, which we can add more states to in the future if we want to.
Okay, I'll watch the recording, but this is a bit of a deviation from what I had in mind, because I feel like the overall complexity would be lower if we move pretty much all of the state management to the backend. Because it sounds like what we're going forward now is like a hybrid approach.
Sure.
Where pretty much all the state management is in the front end, and all that we're doing is that we're querying this one endpoint, which makes me question why we're even adding that endpoint, because
we're not. It's added to the project type. We've got to contact the project type to get the project details.
Let me just finish.
Sorry. I've actually got to run. I've got another meeting I need to get to, but I will watch the end of this recording to find out what you two decided.
All right.
Sorry. Bye.
What I mean is, like, we don't need if we're going with this approach, then we don't need a new endpoint or GraphQL attribute. And I'm using endpoint here like interchangeably.
Yeah.
Because if we're calling the initialize endpoint or GraphQL like mutation or whatever it is, then this could just be an internal backend check, and the backend could just be like, no, like I'm already busy.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
That's what this is, though. So the check, how would you make that check from the front end without this?
That's what I'm saying. If we do all the state management in the front end, then we don't need to do this implementation. Like the thing that this issue is trying to solve is trying to prevent two stacks being initialized at the same time.
Yes.
If the backend internally can tell us, hey, thumbs down, I'm not going to initialize it because for whatever reason, and the reason in this case is it is currently busy initializing for another user who requested this or whatever.
Right. Okay.
Then it doesn't really matter, because all the users, like from the user's experience, they're not going to see like, oh, there's a loading screen and a stack is initializing, but that's a pretty rare occurrence. So the cost for me there isn't, I don't feel like that's something we need to absolutely cover. Like the thing that we need to cover is just one user like accidentally establishes like 5 different stacks because it got stuck on loading, whatever.
Yeah.
But I'd still would like us to actually loop back and just think about like implementing like that pseudocode I have there, like in a method.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also need to run in about a minute, but I think this would be good to continue on as a discussion point for tomorrow.
That's fine. I think we're a bit further along. I'll upload this to Unfiltered and give your thoughts some more thought. I'll follow up async and we can figure something out.
Cool. Thanks.
Nice one. Jiaan.
Ciao.